First, who was the initiator of the event?
Yes, I do remember that I was this normal day at my office. I was Prime Minister at Castile, and I received a phone call from the ambassador of the Soviet Union in Malta. And he told me that he wanted to see me urgently in the company of the ambassador of the United States of America. And I said, okay, it's 11 now o'clock in the morning. I said, we can meet at, say, 6 in the afternoon. He said, well, I'm afraid that the matter is more urgent and we need to see you as early as possible, possibly this morning. I said, well, this morning it's an hour and it will be noon. I said, all right, we'll meet at 4 in the afternoon. He said, 4 will do. And they came together, and the first thing they said, we're here on behalf of our presidents who have asked us to see you and to put a question to you. And the question was, would Malta host a meeting between President Gorbachev and President Bush in Malta? My immediate reply was, with open arms. So immediately I said yes, so they'd be very, very welcome in Malta. But then they said, you have to talk about how it will all be handled in Malta. For example, he said, you can expect something like 3,000 or more, possibly, reporters coming into Malta for the event. Do you have enough hotels? And I smiled and I said, well, of course we do. I can assure you there'll be enough beds to host any number of visitors to Malta at any point in time. And then they said, we're going to make an announcement at 12 noon New York, Washington time, and that's why they wanted to see me early. I said, immediately, of course, there will be a rush calling on you and asking questions about the whole thing and how it's going to happen and what. I said, well, everybody will be welcome in Malta. I said, I'll take immediate steps and I will inform Parliament when it was due to convene at 6 o'clock that afternoon that I have given my assent for the meeting to take place in Malta. I immediately consulted with the leader of the opposition then, who was Dr. Carnello Subbanigi. When I told him about this possibility of the meeting being held here, he said, well, of course, it's a great thing and they will be welcome in Malta. That was the first reaction. He changed his attitude later. So this was a very short meeting where I immediately said yes to the meeting. Then, of course, we started discussing, not me personally, my office started discussing the details of the meeting. This was only a couple of weeks, a few weeks before the meeting actually took place on the 2nd and 3rd December. When discussing the details and the logistics, where would the meeting take place? I had been informed that the two presidents wished to meet on 2 naval vessels, and immediately understood why. I do remember, as a young boy, the visit to Malta of President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, and they had in Malta prior to their meeting in Yalta with Stalin, and they had met on 2 warships. And the idea was that the 2 presidents, Gorbachev and Bush, would meet on 2 warships, a USSR warship and a USA warship, both moored in one of our harbors, not the Grand Harbor. They had chosen Birzabuja, Marsashlok. They even chose the backdrop of the 2 ships. And I said, well, no problem if you meet on the 2 ships, but of course you will be coming on land and you will be making courtesy call on the President and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister was, of course, myself. Initially there were no problems. I mean, President Gorbachev immediately said yes. I mean, not to we, I mean, through the person who was contacting his office, said no problem. When Bush was contacted, he said, well, he made it known that he feared there would be some hostile demonstrations, and he said, I prefer not to call on the President and the Prime Minister, as the meeting was not being held on land, it was being planned on the 2 warships. I was told, I said, no way. He said, if the President does not make a courtesy call on the President of Malta and on the Prime Minister, he will not be welcome. The reply went through. President Bush was very hesitant, and finally I spoke personally through, who was this, Brent Scowcroft, I think, phoned me up and he said, we have this problem. Can I put you through to the president? I said, yes, of course. I spoke to President Bush. I told him, well, the President of the United States can't come to Malta and not call on the President of Malta and the Prime Minister. It's only a courtesy call. I don't expect anything beyond that, but it has to be done. He said, but what about demonstrations? I can assure you, I said, there will be no hostile demonstrations anywhere where you will be in Malta while you are on land in Malta. He said, I'll take your word. So I'll be making, this was the only hitch about the visit. What happened really was, as I said, I informed Parliament, informed the leader of the opposition, everybody was saying how welcome this would be, but then the opposition had second thoughts, and they said, 2 warships will be coming into our harbors, and according to our constitution, Malta should not host any warships in our harbors. And I said, this is silly, this is not warships, this is 2 presidents meeting in Malta, they're not going to make war in Malta. But there was a threat of some demonstration saying that this could breach our constitutional provisions, which I said was not on at all, it wasn't true, it was nothing anywhere near the truth. But this made Bush think twice about making a courtesy call on the President and myself. Well, when the meeting took place, everything went very, very smoothly. When I do remember that President Gorbachev arrived first, late at night. He came directly from Milan. The day before he had been in Rome, met the Pope, then went to Milan and flew to Malta, and he arrived shortly before midnight. And there were crowds greeting him, crowds at the airport, crowds along the route. I remember Floriana and the entry into Valletta, and people were there greeting him, and the square outside Castile was literally full of people. And what I distinctly remember was that President Gorbachev went around shaking hands with everybody around. He had quite some tough, his own security around him, pushing people, but people insisted, and he himself was really plunging himself into the crowd and shaking hands all around. Then he went into my office. We had a very small tete-a-tete, very pleasant, I must say. It was something I will never really forget. I immediately, of course, I had read and known and been following Gorbachev and his policies, but meeting him personally was quite a treat for me to see him in my office. The next day, President Bush arrived, and he preferred not coming to my office by car, but he came in his plane at Lua Airport and flew in a helicopter to my office. I met him at the airport and flew with him in a helicopter to Floriana, and he came to my office. Again, he was extremely courteous and praising Malta, and of course recalling Roosevelt's visit to Malta at the end of the Great War, Second Great War. So it was again a very, very encouraging conversation. And incidentally, I had met President Bush before in Washington. I met him twice, in fact, when he was already president, and before when he was vice president. I had been in 1988 on an official visit to the United States, received by President Reagan and Vice President Bush then. As I said, what is interesting was what people were expecting out of this meeting here in Malta. First of all, it wasn't being described as a summit between the 2 superpowers. It was being described as a meeting, a sort of personal introduction between the 2 presidents. In fact, it is known that there was no official agenda of discussions that would take place, but really it was taking stock by the 2 presidents of each other's personality, getting to know each other. And the result, I think, was marvelous. After the meeting, as I said, they didn't meet on land. Eventually, they met on a Soviet cruise liner. You know the story there. I mean, when they came to Malta and they had the 2 ships already berthed in the Marsaxlok harbor, there was a storm, was expected, and our people, the weather forecasters here, informed them that there was going to be a big storm. And I said, well, big storm in Malta, in the Maltese harbor, what can that mean? As a matter of fact, the American warship, the Belknap, dragged its anchor, and we had to send a ship, what do we call it, to help it, not to get stuck. And it was pulled out during the night. Then it was a big storm the next day, and Gorbachev never set foot on the USSR military ship, but he only went on the Maxim Gorby. Bush insisted that he would go on the Belknap. And I remember his entourage telling me that they thought he would drown, because it was such a difficult thing to get on the ship from the small craft that took him to the Belknap. It was really, the storm was something out extraordinary. I remember making a comment to the journal. I said, this bodes something very great happening in Malta, because we all know of a very other important storm in Maltese history. It was the shipwreck of St. Paul in AD 60 to Malta, which brought Christianity to Malta. So I said, I am convinced, this was before the meeting had started. I said, I'm convinced that a lot of good is going to come out of this meeting. And that, in fact, was borne out, because now everybody describes the meeting as Malta as the dumping of the Cold War and the warm waters of the Mediterranean. I am citing, in fact, Shevardnadze in his autobiography. So the meeting went extremely well. The two presidents, I think, gained a lot of self-confidence and confidence in each other. And from that moment on, it was clear that the world has changed, and that Malta had played a part in it. And we were very proud that Malta had played a part in it. How did it all happen? Why Malta? I think the story is told in a book by Brent Scowcroft and George Bush. They recount the presidency, the several anecdotes about the presidency, and when it comes to all places in the world, and neither President Bush or President Gorbachev wouldn't agree. Then President Bush, at one of the meetings, had his brother present, formal meetings in the White House. His name was, I think, called Bill Bush, who told him, I have been in Malta. He had been in Malta for the 25th celebration of our independence on the 21st of September 1989. I had met him then. And he said, Malta is an extraordinary place. The people are so friendly. Malta is ideal. And Bush said, yes, true, why not Malta? He said, of course, Churchill had met Roosevelt in Malta. Why don't we meet in Malta? And he said, somebody picked up the telephone, spoke to President Gorbachev, told him, what about Malta? He said, Malta? Oh yes, that's great, Malta. And they couldn't agree on any other country, and all of a sudden, Bush's brother makes this proposal, and they choose Malta, which is, I think, quite interesting in itself. Incidentally, I had met Bush's brother for the celebrations here in Malta. And immediately after the celebrations, on the 22nd September, I had been to New York for a meeting, I think, of the United Nations General Assembly. And I had met President Bush on that occasion. And to my surprise, I was in a long queue of people to greet the president. Somebody came along and said, you don't wait in the queue, I take you up. And I skipped everybody else and was taken right to the president. And I said, oh, well, what? Well, how? And the reason was that Bush, the president, had spoken to his brother about Malta, and when the Prime Minister of Malta turned up on this occasion, I was immediately introduced to President Bush. You know, it's a conglomeration of incidents which I think explain how Malta came to be the venue for this historic meeting.
A very interesting story. In this connection, I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You mentioned during your story that you've met President Bush before. What about President Gorbachev?
No, I hadn't met President Gorbachev before. No, I didn't have the occasion to do it, but of course, having been Prime Minister myself through those positively turbulent years, I was following closely events in the USSR and the part that Gorbachev was playing, his perestroika I still have the book. I had immediately bought that publication and read through it, and impressed by the restructuring that Gorbachev was proposing for the Soviet Union. So I was really thrilled when I was aware that I would be meeting Gorbachev here in Malta. So I hadn't known him before. I met him here in Malta for the first time at that meeting. Then I had occasion to meet him informally on other international occasions, conferences, can't remember exactly which and what, but several occasions, and he would recognize me, and of course I was very pleased when I saw that he still remembered the meeting in Malta and remembered me in particular.
So we can say that you established really warm relationship.
Yes, yes, I think we did. And even with his late wife, Raisa, I remember she was shown around by my wife and my daughter. My daughter cherishes pictures of herself with Raisa. And some interesting anecdotes there as well. I mean, of course, while the meeting was taking place, Mrs. Gorbachev was on land and was taken around, as I said, by my wife and my daughter. And she wanted to visit normal workers' dwellings. And they were in Paola near Santa Lucia, and they stopped there and actually knocked on one of the doors. And my daughter said, "The wife of President Gorbachev is with me and she would like to come into the house." The lady opened and oh, she's very welcome. And I do remember that Mrs. Gorbachev said, "But is this a normal house?" Were they informed? And no, not at all. I mean, they were not aware that you would be coming. It just we knocked on the door and they opened, they let you in. And another thing I do remember, you know Malta, there's the big cemetery, the only big cemetery in Malta, down the road from Paola. And Mrs. Gorbachev saw the crosses there, and she made the driver stop. She came out of the car, said, "What a beautiful cemetery this is." You know, this gives an inkling, of course, of Raisa's character as well. How she was interested in people, how she not just a bystander, on the contrary. She got involved in anything that touched social life.
Well, we have similar opinion about First Lady. Unfortunately,
she passed away.
It is First Lady for such a long time, and unfortunately, President Gorbachev once again held the post for quite a short period of time, and I'm sure that if the period was longer, there were a couple of more events for you to meet, because from your words, I'm assuming that you really found a way how to communicate.
Oh yes, I mean, he was a great communicator, no doubt about it.
Any interesting recollections from informal communication, maybe?
Well, nothing in particular, except that he was very homely. I mean, it's a person, you didn't have any awe to speak to him. I mean, you weren't afraid to talk to him or anything of the sort. You felt you were talking to a friend. And I think that is something quite important for a person of that stature and having that responsibility. You have to remember what the USSR was then, you know.
Definitely. You mentioned that President Bush had a few concerns about demonstrations, protests, and anything of that type. As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, there are quite high standards from both countries imposed on security matter. Can you maybe mention something in this respect?
Well, I know the matter was discussed with our chief of security, who was the commissioner of police. I am not aware that there were any problems at all. There was very good cooperation from all sides, and no incident at all, no complaints or anything of the sort. I mean, everything went very, very smoothly. Because I think also, although there were rumors that some hostile demonstration could be possible, there were none, in fact. And I think all Malta was really grateful that this visit that happened here in Malta.
Any particular requests maybe from both?
I don't know. I'm not aware that there were any particular requests at all. There was full consultation, full cooperation, and there were no problems either before, during, or after. Of course, all strict security was usually taken care of. For example, I remember the 2 warships in Marsaxlokk. Of course, we had divers going to the sea and checking where anything was happening. But I mean, normal security, this is expected on such occasions.
In fact, talking about sea, talking about weather, this great storm that happened incidentally at that time, was at any point decision to basically hold this summit on these 2 warships reconsidered any other proposals, change of venue maybe?
Yes, I mean when we became aware, I mean, a couple of days before that there was going to be a storm, we said, well, we have agreed that the meeting would actually take place on the warships, and we understand the reasons behind that. But he said, we're prepared to offer you, of course, a place in Malta. I remember offering my country residence at Girgenti, where that could be held. But I think we were upped by the Soviet Union then, because they provided this cruiser, the Maxim Gorky was it, and they said, he said, there's such a big delegation and so many are coming with us that we'll use it for a residence. Instead of going to hotel, we'll use the cruise liner to accommodate these people. They didn't tell us that they intended to have the meetings there. But then when the storm was really so big and they couldn't make it to the warship, they said, well, perhaps we'll have the meetings on the cruise liner. I said, well, I have no objection, but we can make available several places in Malta, which could be, I'm quite sure, very accommodating. But they preferred meeting on the cruise liner. I don't know finally whose decision was it. I should think it was both President Gorbachev and President Bush.
So basically you mentioned that both delegations, they stayed majority of the time on the ships. Any schedule, any particular program, how the time was spent by both heads of states, maybe the delegations?
The heads of state didn't have any free time at all, practically. I mean, as I said, Bush arrived in the morning and Gorbachev had arrived late at night. So the whole day they spent in Malta, I think, was the whole day taken up by meetings on board the cruise liner. So they didn't have really any free time at all. Their delegations, apart from, of course, their close collaborators who were present at the meetings, I mean, they went around unnoticed. And, as I said, Mrs. Gorbachev had a few hours and she went around seeing places. She went to St. John's Cathedral and other places in Malta with no difficulty at all.
Okay. Another question, if you don't mind. Notice event.
Yes.
Held basically a couple of maybe months before they arrived.
I think it was less than a couple of months.
Okay.
I am saying it because I was in Berlin, I was in Bonn and visited Berlin soon after the first breach in the wall. In fact, I think the date was the 20th of November, 89, maybe not the exact date, but anyhow, November 89, and I walked through the breach from west to east Berlin, and I was told that I was the first head of government to walk from the western part of Berlin to the eastern part from the breach. And I do remember, as I was back in the western part, a small Trabi car coming along, and they stopped and greeted me, and I was introduced as the Prime Minister of Malta to these people. It was a family, the parents and 2 children in the small East German car, who were really, feeling out of this world, traveling into Western Berlin. This was shortly before, of course, the Bush-Gorbachev meeting here in Malta. I remember meeting Kohl, and we spoke about the proposed visit, the proposed meeting in Malta. So I think it was only a few weeks, not months, sure.
Okay, so basically, since it was a short notice, as I mentioned, it was preferred to be kept low profile in a way meeting, not something really scheduled.
Yes, I think the two presidents wanted it that way. They didn't want any formalities at all. I mean, the whole idea was that it wouldn't be a summit. It turned out to be a very important summit. But their idea was to have a chat between themselves, to get to know each other in an atmosphere which was very friendly, with no disturbances at all, no formal meetings at all. So it was something quite unique. I don't think it ever happened. So even the fact of where the venue was, I mean, their meeting on the ships, as they had intended, was part of this strategy to make it low profile, very low profile.
So we spoke about both presidents already. You mentioned that that you met President Gorbachev for the first time, though you met President Bush a number of times before. Was there any idea to follow up maybe this
well, no,
this
not
friendship,
really.
I hope?
Not really, but of course, let me explain. I mean, it did give us impetus. I mean, I have to remark that this is 1989, and I had been elected Prime Minister in May of 1987, barely 2 years before, and we had been through a very difficult period in Malta before 1987. So the meeting gave us stature. I mean, the fact that the two world leaders chose Malta, and we had, of course, free publicity during the meeting. I mean, all the television stations of the world, I'm not exaggerating, were here present in Malta, and probably they all interviewed me, or most of them interviewed me as Prime Minister, you know. So it gave us a big boost. I did visit, in fact, after that I received a formal invitation to make us an official visit to the Soviet Union, and I was there in 1991. Things had changed there, and it was President Yeltsin whom I met. But I think it was part of the impetus of the meeting in Malta. And the relations were very good. I remember discussing bilateral relations, agreements. So it wasn't, I wouldn't call it a follow-up, but you know, it gave us a boost in terms of relations with the Soviet Union at the time, and Russia. And with the United States, we had already had stronger ties, even through immigration. I mean, you find many people emigrated to the United States. I mean, there are big communities of Maltese residing in the United States, so there are close ties there.
Another question, which basically we went through newspapers of that time, but I think you can give us just a better feeling how it was promoted in media at that time.
I think the dictum that was most known was from Malta to Yalta and from Yalta to Malta. And the word, in the sense that the world had gone full circle. I mean, the prelude to the Yalta meeting was in Malta between Churchill and Roosevelt. That led to agreements which were not exactly the best for Europe. All that was undone by the meeting in Malta. So I think it was closing a period of history and closing it positively. And these variants of this feeling, I think, would be found in newspapers of those days.
Then, in this respect, I have another question. You mentioned that maybe it was one of the first meetings between two presidents. Were there any changes in mood, general mood in delegations before and after the meeting? Did they become closer members of delegation?
Of their delegations, you mean? Well, I'm not aware, but I suppose they did. I mean, the fact that the end result of the meeting was so positive was, appreciated very much by everybody around.
Well, basically, I'm done with the questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I consider, of course, that meeting as a turning point even for Malta. I think from then on, we were very much in the international map. Of course, many people already knew about Malta, but all of a sudden we got so much publicity that it helped us along to continue to build Malta. Investment-wise, the economy progressing, I think it was a boost to Malta in itself as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. It was a really great experience to meet you.